Welcome back, guys. We are excited to be having another video here with James, our resident scholar, and Michael as well. And we're going to be discussing some of James's finds on the internet. James, what website have you been poring over, perusing, that has been giving you some interesting finds? You've been talking about it. What is it?
Vatican Digital Library. So it's kind of like the hardest library to crack because it's like got old medieval manuscripts, the typesets and handwritten, so you can't really search it as easily with like an OCR, search engine thing. You actually have to read it manually page to page. So it's kind of tough to crack. But,
and how long has the Vatican Digital Library been out there?
Yeah, so the in-house digitization began back in 2010 with the launch of the DigiVatLib website. And they're looking to digitize the entire manuscript collection as well as 80,000 church codices with 40 million scanned records. So this goes approximately records from the 8th century to the 20th century. There's about 600 fonds, which is basically these sub-library collections. And so, the point here today is to kind of share a little bit about the library to increase awareness of it, what's available there, and what's supportive of the Adventist understanding of the Great Controversy narrative.
So that's a big undertaking to digitize that many documents. That's like the Library of Congress or something. I mean, that's like a huge amount of information to scan in, and they're doing it all for us, I guess.
Yeah, it does make it nice to actually search it and find the content for anybody. Not just, you don't have to have a PhD, but us ordinary folks can actually go and search it now, which is kind of cool. In Great Controversy 606, Michael, what do we read here?
It says, the sins of Babylon will be laid open. The fearful results of enforcing the observance of the church by civil authority, the inroads of spiritualism, the stealthy but rapid progress of the papal power, all will be unmasked. By these solemn warnings, the people will be stirred. Thousands upon thousands will listen who have never heard words like these. In amazement, they hear the testimony that Babylon is the church, fallen because of her errors and sins, because of her rejection of the truth sent to her from heaven. As the people go to their former teachers with the eager inquiry, are these things so? The ministers present fables, prophesy smooth things to soothe their fears and quiet the awakened conscience. But since many refuse to be satisfied with mere human authority and demand a plain, "Thus saith the Lord," the popular ministry, like the Pharisees of old, filled with anger as their authority is questioned, will denounce the message as of Satan and stir up the sin-loving multitudes to revile and persecute those who proclaim it.
So we're going to see some stuff being unveiled, and I believe that time is here in some ways.
So how exciting is it to be able to be part of the unmasking to show the rest of the world?
True.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting endeavor. So the BAV, or the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, is what we're going to take a look at. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is what the website looks like when you first pull it up. You're going to see something like this, and you're going to see a search bar there. Now, one thing I'll say about the search bar is I've found by experience that this does not necessarily, if you type something into that search bar, it does not necessarily mean that, and you don't find it, that it's not in the library, because a lot of this stuff is very halfway, detailed in terms of what it actually is. So you might get a reference of like a Latin manuscript, vat.lat.1397 or something like that, but it doesn't necessarily, this search engine doesn't necessarily have everything that's detailed in that manuscript, like all of the different chapters or books that are contained, documented. So I've found some documents through outside collations and catalogs that detail some of that information that you won't necessarily find on the search bar when you type it in here.
And like you were saying, OCR, optical character recognition, just because you take a picture of the page doesn't mean that they've gone through and exhaustively seen that all the words are in text form that you can easily copy and then
search. Yeah, it's a challenge. So one of the resources that I've relied upon is this outside work here done by the site Wiglaf,
Mhm.
and they have some interesting background information into some of the various fonds. So here's a few that were recently digitized in 2024. The Barb fond or the Borg fond or some of these other, you got the VAT the fond, and we're going to see the Reg fond and some of the other ones that they talk about and how those collections came to be a part of the library. But in order to organize this today, the way I thought about going about this is kind of going in the order of the Great Controversy.
Okay.
So beginning with some of the evidence that we find back at the kind of the early centuries. And to start with, we're going to go back to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Mhm.
Because one of the first pieces of evidence right here is actually evidence that the early Jews did not keep the Sabbath in a lunar sense, but very much in a weekly seventh-day cycle. So we see this in Frontinus Stratagem. The divine Augustus Vespasian attacked the Jews on the day of Saturn, a day which it is sinful for them to do any business. So we got some people floating around today that try and think that the Jews early on held to a lunar Sabbath for the weekly Sabbath, not the lunar system in terms of the feast days. Well, we know that they use the lunar system for the
Sure.
feast,
Right.
but for God's seventh day Sabbath. This particular document refutes that idea because it demonstrates that they kept it on the day of Saturn or Saturday,
Right.
and that's according to the commandment of God every seventh day of the week. So
Interesting.
it's just some interesting evidence that answers some of those people today that try and make that argument, one of many that Adventists face out there in the world.
Yeah.
The early church had some interesting evidence here. Irenaeus identified the scapegoat, Azazel, as that mighty and yet fallen angel. Now, who would that be?
Lucifer.
Right,
Satan.
right. So he states, which Satan, thy true father, enables thee to still to accomplish by means of Azazel, that fallen and yet mighty angel. So the idea that the scapegoat being Satan, a representative of Satan, is that an Adventist idea?
No.
Doesn't look like it, no.
No, that one goes back a long time. And we find actually here, interestingly enough, also some evidence in the Shepherd of Hermas. The great and glorious angel Michael is he who has authority over this people and governs them, for this is he who gave them the law into the hearts of believers. Now, what scripture in the New Testament do we find where the law is written on the heart of believers?
So Hebrews 8.
Yeah, Hebrews 8, the New Covenant, and who writes the law in our hearts?
Oh, Christ does.
Right, well, through the Holy Spirit.
Through the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, Christ writes the law on our hearts,
Mhm.
and we see here evidence of connecting that back to Michael.
Mm-hmm.
So, Adventists do get a lot of people out there saying, where did you come up with this idea of Michael being Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
You see that all over. But
Yeah.
here we can see basically that it's an older concept than Adventism.
So the early church also had statements like this, recognizing the actually Augustine. Now, some people are going to quote other aspects of Augustine where he seems to kind of go against his thoughts here, but nevertheless, there is evidence regarding the eating the flesh of the Son of Man. It is therefore a figure.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So is it a literal or is it a figurative? Is it a symbol or is it literal eating of God's flesh?
Well, that's one of the main tenets of Catholicism to this point is the Eucharist, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're
Right.
literally eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood.
Yeah.
Irenaeus stated here, as our master therefore did not at once depart, taking flight to heaven, but waited the time of his resurrection prescribed by the Father, which had been shown forth through Jonas, and rising again after 3 days was taken up to heaven, so ought we also to await the time of our resurrection prescribed by God and foretold by the prophets, and so rising, be taken up as many as the Lord shall account worthy of this. So do we see evidence here? Those who are in the grave today, are they in heaven or are they awaiting in the grave for resurrection?
We're waiting in the grave. We have a concept of soul sleep.
Right. Jerome, of course, in the early church, once again on the Apocrypha, rejected the Apocrypha. He said, avoid all apocryphal writings. It requires infinite discretion to look for gold in the midst of dirt. Now that we've seen some aspects of gold already, for example, in the Shepherd of Hermas, where Michael is identified with Christ. There is biblical evidence of that. We see, at the voice of the archangel and the trump of God, all the dead shall arise.
There's only one that can bring the dead to life.
Yes, all who hear my voice shall arise. So
Right.
Christ identifies in John that those who hear his voice will arise. Jerome rejected the Apocrypha, stating that wisdom, Solomon, Judith, Tobias, and the shepherd are not in the canon. Here we read Jerome speaking on the fables of Bel and the dragon. So fabulas right there. Nec bellis draconisc fabulas, a fable.
What now? The Bell, the fables of Bel and the dragon, is that in the Apocrypha?
Yeah, it was supposed to be an extra chapter of the book of Daniel, where it's this interesting account where they go and see something like missing in the temple, and so he goes and feeds this dragon like some cakes and stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
anyhow, it's kind of a fantastical tale. But Gregory the Great rejected the Apocrypha here. We are not acting irregularly if from the books, though not canonical, yet brought forward for the edifying of the church. Eleazar in the battle smote and brought down an elephant. That's from the book of Maccabees right there. And what we see right here is si ex libris licet non canonicis. And this comes from the Latin manuscript 83. Now, this one I don't believe this one's actually not from the Vatican Digital Library in particular, but I did go and find a copy of the same book in the Vatican Digital Library, and here is this particular copy, the manuscript, Book 19, Archcap San Pietro. This was actually, I believe this particular font was digitized back in 2019. The bulk of them were digitized back in 2019. But though not canonical, yet brought out for the edifying of the church. So did Pope Gregory the Great accept the canons of Carthage and Rome regarding the canon? I think not.
No.
There was some rejection there. And what I find interesting is, Rome's argument is that somehow Carthage and Rome was where the canon was established. But what we find is those early councils affirmed Esdras as canonical from the Septuagint. Here is the Codex, I believe this is either the Vaticanus or the Sinaiticus text. I don't remember which two of this is, but yeah, vat.greek.1209. And as for this is particularly quoting Esdras 1 verse 55. As for the house of the Lord, they burnt it and brake down the walls of Jerusalem and set fire upon her towers. Now, Esdras 1 in the Septuagint is not the same as Esdras 1 in the Vulgate. So what happens is you get down to Trent, and when they affirm the canon there, they do something very subtle, and a lot of people miss this. They affirm Esdras 1 as identified in the Latin Vulgate. They're not the same.
Right.
They're not the same. And there's an admission, in case somebody out there is watching this and says, oh, you're making that up. No, there's actually an admission right here in the Catholic Encyclopedia itself. Until the 5th century, Christians very frequently ranked 3rd Esdras with the canonical books. It is found in many LXX, MSS, and the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome, because 3rd Esdras was actually 1st Esdras in the Septuagint. They state Protestants therefore include 3rd Esdras with other apocryphal deuterocanonical books such as Tobit or Judith. The Council of Trent definitively removed it from the canon. They state that uncertainty that persisted up to the time of Trent. So there's a shift there. There's a subtle change. They couldn't establish their canon for over 1,000 years. And people don't understand that today, that there's a difference there between the Septuagint and the Vulgate.
A lot of times the argument is that, have you heard this before, that basically, well, you guys are just throwing out books of the Bible.
Yeah.
That the apostles wrote. You're just throwing them out.
Yeah.
One of the things that Gregory the Great also had talked about was that the idea of a universal priest being a precursor of Antichrist. But here we see in the Dictatus Papae right here, and this is vat.lat.1321, that the Roman pontiff was founded by God alone. The Roman pontiff alone can be with right be called universal. I mean, the very thing that Gregory the Great warned about as the precursor of Antichrist is actually right here on the left there, quod solus Romanus pontifex iure dicator universalis, justly called universal. Gregory the Great, we would hope, I mean, if the guy had any honesty left in him at all, would be spinning in his grave if he knew about this.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Here we see throughout in these documents, actually evidence that early on people recognized the 1260 days as 1260 years. So the day-year principle, applying that to that time period, which we know as Protestants applies from 538 to 1798 for the papal power. Joachim of Flores in the 12th century recognized pro anno in 1200 sexaginta diebus pro tuodum anni, or years. So the day-year principle.
Ani, you see it right there.
Yeah. Annis. This was an interesting one, a 13th century bishop, French bishop, stating, when we read of Michael fighting the dragon, we understand allegorically Michael, that is Christ. Id est, in case somebody argues, .I is an abbreviation for id est as well as IE. And some people are going to say, well, but he said allegorically. Nevertheless, there is a connection there between Michael and Christ. So there were people that made that connection, once again, long before Adventists did. The 12th century physician Arnold of Villanova, long before Adventists, people were recognizing when he says 2,300 days, it must be said that by days he understands years. So for the 2,300 days, we're talking over 800 years, well, give or take, 12th century, okay, maybe 600 or 700, but you're looking at hundreds of years before William Miller. Dies intelligit annus. Days we understand as years for Daniel 8:14. That's a rejection of Antiochus Epiphanes. Of course, you have to reject that, and the a literal time period there. You have to logically apply it. It says a much bigger time. Here's another individual, the monk of Bamberg in the Semini Scripturum. Under the first letter A, Daniel grew up. Under the second letter, he died. Unto the evening and the morning, 2,300, and he lists all of these in hundreds of years, actually. Now, there were Jewish scholars, for example, this one right here, Rashi, who recognized the 2,300 years, evening and morning, specifically trying to apply it as, once again, as years, and that his manuscript is on the Vatican Digital Library. I didn't try and go sort through the Hebrew here because it's hard enough to try in the Latin here, in the Hebrew handwritten.
Reading backwards.
Forget about it. No, I wasn't going there. We did find Claude of Turin, which I was really excited about. These manuscripts, I actually went through and checked the Latin on it and said, is there anything digitized for Claude of Turin on like an OCR book from like the past several hundred years?
Who was Claude of Turin?
Claude of Turin was about the 8th, 9th century, and he was kind of a proto-Protestant in believing in justification by faith. And he was located in kind of North Italy and a little bit of a dissident with Rome, kind of recognized by some as almost a proto-Waldensi, but definitely evidence there of Protestant thought long before, the 16th century and so on, the events that we find later on. This was an interesting manuscript. I just found this one here. A lot of these manuscripts, I'll just comment, were the common colors that are used. Michael, what common colors do you see there?
Red and blue or purple.
Yeah, it's a blue. It's kind of like a blue color, but red and blue, or red and almost purple in some cases. But this was an interesting one. There's a lot of them that feature the dragon. You see that just very frequently on these. Now, there's a lot of these manuscripts that contain the Vicarius Fidei, and we've talked about this before. Here's multiple, the Decretum Gratiani and the Archcap St. Pietro font. We find also the Distinctio 96 Satis Evidenter, where the Pope is shown to be God. So the Latin for 2 Thessalonians 2:4, sedeat ostendens setamquam sit Deus. But in the Latin for this particular body of canon law, satis evidenter ostenditur, Deum or Deum appellatum, the Pope is shown to be God. We find Vicarius Filii Dei on this copy of canon law right here, 1366. We see 2493, once again, Vicarius Filii Dei, right there, Petrus Filii Dei, constituted. Here's another copy, 1368, and you're going to see also right here, Ros.307, so that like St. Peter on earth, he is seen to be constituted Vicarius Filii Dei. So this was literally established by law. I don't know how much more authoritative you can possibly get. The claims that some people make that this wasn't somehow an authoritative title, it's all over their entire library. So here's another one right here. This is Ross, stamp.Ross.1197, folio 96V, Petrus and Terrace Vicarius Filii Dei.
May I ask? Sorry. So for those who are watching, what is Vicarius Filii Dei, and what significance has it? Are you going to get into?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for reminding me. So Vicarius Filii Dei meaning vicar of the Son of God, and it adds up to 666. So in the Latin gematria. And one of the things that, some people have questioned, like, well, how do you add that up? Like just adding Roman numeral after Roman numeral. One of the things that I find in some of these older folios, take a look at this. This is how some of the Latin actually, some of the numeration for these numerals worked. Here's a shot of Distinctio 14 right here in one of these manuscripts. Notice it's XIII and not XIV. The subtraction method that we find in some modern like Roman numeral stuff is a little different in these older manuscripts. It was common for them to put like CCCC for 400. And then, XX for 40, and then 4, you would add 4 ones. So some cases they would avoid the subtraction system, and you would just literally add up all the numbers. Like just add them up. There's no subtraction.
And by
at
subtraction number, you mean having a lower value in front of a higher value.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So in some of these manuscripts, you see evidence of that kind of principle being utilized, and it's very interesting. I would say the reason why on some of them we see more of the subtractive principle is because it saves a lot of space and ink. But if you're going for the full add, you write out all the numbers, and you don't do any subtraction at all.
Well, that's something that is evident with some of our old books, which we need to do a video about.
Yeah.
But if you go there and look at the date that the book was published, they'll have it counted out.
Yeah.
Frequently for the year.
Yeah.
From the 1600s, 1500s. So, Vicarius Filii Dei, which we've done a video about Vicarius Filii Dei before, but vicar in place of the Son of God.
Yeah.
Should anybody be put in place of Christ?
So here's Juana Torquemada using the term on the Vatican Digital Library. You've got Augustinus Triumphus writing his Summa de Potestate Ecclesiae on behalf of Pope John the 22nd, where not only does he defend the Pope as Vicarius Filii Dei, but he also defends the Pope as having authority to change the Sabbath day to the Lord's day. So in the same document, here's our call to be like the replacement or 666 substitute for Christ, and then also to have the authority to change the Sabbath day to the Lord's day in the same document.
Well, if he is the replacement of Christ, then he's also Lord of the Sabbath, isn't he?
In the same document, he says, second reason considering the role of the Pope, only the Pope is said to be the vicar of God because he alone is able to bind and loose, possessing alone, loosing and binding given to him by God. The decision of the Pope and the decision of God constitute one decision, just as the decision of the Pope and his disciple are the same, since therefore an appeal is always taken from an inferior judge to a superior, as no one is greater than himself. So no appeal holds when made from the Pope to God, because there is one consistory of the Pope himself and of God himself, of which consistory the Pope himself is the key-bearer and doorkeeper. Therefore no one can appeal from the Pope to God, as no one can enter into the consistory of God without the mediation of the Pope, who is the key-bearer and the doorkeeper of the consistory of eternal life. And as no one can appeal to himself, no one can appeal from the Pope to God. Yeah.
What kind of hope do you think that places for somebody? You have this nagging thought in the back of your mind if you're a Catholic and you're trying to leave Catholicism of there's no salvation outside the church. There's nobody to mediate for me. There's nobody to to have this relationship other than the Pope by their
Yeah.
own documents.
Yeah, and you can only. I mean, how many people in this world has had a personal experience with the Pope? You can't have it.
No, it's an impersonal religion.
Yeah.
That's the good news. Christ steps in. He will
Mhm.
be that mediator.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And he's the only mediator.
It is to be seen as fact that the honor that is due Christ as God is due also to the Pope, because the honor is due the power, and the power of Christ as God and the power of the Pope are one, which is shown to be true. Here's another copy of Augustinus Triumphus' work, where he's also once again vicarius filii and changing the Sabbath. Here's Juan of Torquemada, another copy. We've got another copy of vicarius filii here, pal.lat.621. In that
So basically, you're showing it's littered throughout their entire.
It's littered. I mean, this wasn't
database.
just one document. This was like over and over and over, showing himself to be God. Pal.lat.625. Here we've got pal.lat.623 with vicarius filii Dei. But do we find any actual papal? I mean, not just canon law, but papal letters or documents or constitutions that use it. Here's one, Licet Juxta Doctrina, and this particular one right here, the Christian Emperor Constantine testified, saying the Blessed Peter is seen to have been constituted vicarius filii Dei, and goes on to state that from this it's self-evidently that Peter can be called the supreme head of the universal church. Now, in the 11th century, there was a letter sent to the East regarding the schism in the East and the West. And, part of the argument over that was fasting on the Sabbath. But as part of the letter that was sent in Terra Pax Hominibus, which reg.lat.413, part 2.
And what year was this?
You're looking around the year 1054 when the split occurred. And, you got a letter sent where the Pope is said to have been constituted vicarius filii Dei as the West tries to assert their authority in dictating to the East what they want to get done, and the East would have none of it, and they split. It's sad to see them joining back up today, but...
so that document, that scan of that, is almost 1,000 years old, though.
Well, as far as the particular age of this one, it may be newer. I won't speculate on saying that this particular copy is that old, but it nevertheless is a copy of that letter on their website to this day.
So I imagine they don't have a lot of details about these documents necessarily. They're just scanning them and putting them on there.
Yeah, there's not always very detailed evidence for each one as far as how old it is. Now, they do have the donation of Constantine, the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals also included on there, which of course had vicarius filii Dei in it as well. We talked about this one previously, where they claimed, Catholic websites like Theotokos claimed that vat.lat.1397 did not have Dominum Deum Nostrum Papam, our Lord God the Pope, in it. We found that to be demonstrably false.
And we did that we discussed this on a previous video, actually.
The most ornate manuscript right there, which they say the original, vat.lat.1397, folio 166V. You can go there. You can pull it up yourself. Anybody can go fact check us on this. We're not making this up. You can go on the left column, 6th line down from the top. It's right there. Now, sometimes when you're talking with Catholics, they will say, well, we're not giving latria to idols.
So they break down the term worship. Okay, so there's latria, dulia, and hyperdulia.
Yeah, hyperdulia.
And so explain to us non-Catholics,
Yeah,
what are those three?
Well, they try and make a distinction between adoration and like reverence, and try and basically bifurcate the definition of worship, if you will. Well, we revere, we esteem highly, and so on.
So they say that they don't worship Mary.
Yeah.
But they do adore Mary, or how does that work?
Well, part of the argument goes in regards to, when somebody challenges them on idolatry, well, we're just revering it. We're not actually worshiping it. We're not actually, in some cases, they claim that they're not offering latria to it. But let's take a look at that. Here's an example where Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, we're going to take a look at some of Thomas Aquinas here, taught that that could Christ's cross be worshipped with the adoration of latria? He stated it is worshipped with the same adoration as Christ, the adoration of latria. And to this reason, we speak to the cross and pray to it as to the crucified himself.
Wow. Isn't that, does that not just blow your mind?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand it.
Because it's like you're taking a torture instrument
Mm-hmm.
and giving it homage
Yeah.
and like worshiping it. Like, what?
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas went on to teach that heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to be not only excommunicated, but even put to death. Now, there were also other statements that he made, and you can find these on there as well. First off, Catechism 2176 teaches the celebration of Sunday observes the moral commandment inscribed by nature in the human heart. Now, notice they admit Sunday or the Sabbath being a moral commandment, not merely ceremonial.
Mm-hmm.
To render to God an outward, visible, public, and regular worship as a sign of his universal beneficence to all. Now, God has his sign in what is it? Exodus 31:17 as the Sabbath.
Yeah.
But here's an alternate sign.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's an exterior worship. There's, by the way, the Catechism right there, 2176, references 109, referencing Thomas Aquinas. If you go back to Thomas Aquinas, here's what he states. So to speak first in common principles of the law and consequently the third precept, which, remember, they deleted the second, so they've moved the Sabbath up.
They're talking about the third commandment, and the third commandment to them is the Sabbath.
Describes the exterior worship of God as the sign of a universal boon that concerns all. So it's a sign or a mark, a distinguishing mark of who you worship, whose authority you accept.
Right.
And this is where they start to try and define their...
So they themselves are saying this.
Yes. Now, Aquinas goes on to teach regarding precepts of the Decalogue that to any determination by application to individual actions, they admit of change, sometimes also by human authority, for in this respect men stand in the place of God. Do men stand in the place of God to change that which Christ said would not change by a jot or a tittle? Well, the way this manifested is he taught things like, nevertheless, if the need be so manifest and urgent, it is evident the present need must be remedied by whatever means be at hand. For instance, when a person is in some immediate danger where there's no other possible remedy, then it is lawful for a man to succor his own need by means of another's property, by taking it either openly or secretly, nor is this properly speaking theft and robbery. Now he goes on to state that secrecy is sometimes a cause of sin, as when a man employs secrecy in order to commit a sin, for this instance in fraud and guile. But he states on another way, secrecy is merely of circumstance of sin, and thus it diminishes sin, both because it is a sign of shame and because it removes scandal. Now, I got to ask the question here for just a moment. Think back to the Hebrews. Michael, the Hebrews, when they were faced with the question of death and the burning fiery furnace, what was their position on the law of God?
Well, they basically just said, well, we are going to follow our God, and if you want to try and kill us, our God is able to save us, and if he chooses not to, well, we're still going to die for it.
So for them, the watchword was death before dishonor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in other words, is that principle what they had? They were willing to face death or the risk of death before breaking God's law, consistent with what Thomas Aquinas is teaching here?
No, he's saying self-preservation is the way to go.
Yeah.
He's saying you can do whatever you need to as long as you have enough need. Well, who determines the need? Well, I've determined the need. I've determined I need $1 million, so I'm going to go rob from my brother until I have it.
I mean, they had need, if anybody had need, to escape the fiery furnace, right? But they weren't going to be the ones to go and make that decision and violate God's law.
Yeah. I may be going off a little bit off track here, but so obviously, we're looking at these texts from the Catholic library, right? And so we're not attacking Catholics here.
Yeah,
this is not the idea. But so explain to us, how does all of this relate to Christians these days?
Well, there's a warning in Revelation 14 about a a call to come out of Babylon.
Mhm.
So what we're saying here is that there's a lot of people out there who are sincere, people who are seeking to know Christ. And what we're saying by revealing some of this is, in order to follow Christ, people need to come out of this system right here and back into true biblical Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a condemnation of those people who are sincerely seeking to know Christ. Rather, it's a call, come forth from this system into the commandment-keeping remnant of God, because in this system, there is corruption, there are false principles that are taught, and our goal is not to go and condemn those people who don't know any better, but it is a message to give them that light and say, "Come forth."
Yeah, as the light of the truth shines in, it exposes the darkness and gives people the opportunity to actually see. I've heard Christians make the claim that, well, I believe in Jesus anyway, and so Catholics. There are many good Catholics who are very good Christians who truly do actually like love Jesus. They do all the things that Jesus would do. They live Christian lives. So what difference does it make? This information. What difference does it? Why would you want to hear this information and do anything with it?
The knowledge of the truth, I think, always is going to speak out, and it always has the truth always has a benefit. What do you think, James?
Well, as Christians, part of our mission is to know Christ and to know His character. And what we're finding in this evidence here is a character that is completely at odds with the character of Christ. It is one of pride. It is one of self-exaltation. It is one of changing the laws which define the character of Christ. And so if we are called as Christians to be like Christ, this is not like Christ. So there's a danger there. If you really want to be like Christ, then how can you follow this system?
Yeah, follow what is Christ-like.
Yeah. So this is an example right here. Daniel 7 verse 25 warned about a little horn that would think to change times and laws. And here we see the Pope is said to have a heavenly power of determination, therefore changes the nature of things, and that his will stands for law, and that he can set free from the obligation of the law, and that he can make just that which is unjust by correcting and changing laws. And the Latin word mutando there is the same one that you find in the Latin Vulgate for the little horn, thinking to change times and laws. Mutando. In this particular copy of Pope Clement's Clementine Constitutions, we see right here where he defended, or it was defended here in the margins here, takes the place of God on the earth, that the Pope was not God, not man, but something between the two, Father of fathers. Now, elsewhere you'll find other statements where they went so far as to state that the Pope was God, as we've seen already. Here's once again another statement: for not man, but God separates those whom the Roman pontiff, who exercises the functions not of a mere man, but of the true God, having weighed the necessity or benefit of the churches, dissolves, not by human, but rather with divine authority. Now, this one was an interesting one. Speaking of the priests, stating are sometimes called gods, sometimes angels. For though Moses, it is said, of the one that is to be led an oath, applied him to the gods, that is, to the priests. And again, it is written, do not approach the gods, namely to the priests. It's interesting here, they state that ecclesiastical history also testifies to this, for when accusations were brought against the bishops in writing before the Emperor Constantine of blessed memory, he indeed received the accusations in writing, and called together the bishops who had been accused. He burned the accusation letters in their presence, saying, ye are gods, appointed by the true God. And again saying, ye are gods appointed by the true God. Go among you and dispute the causes, for it is not fitting that we should judge gods. So they were above judgment, and they were the ones to go and judge. We have multiple copies of some of these statements about the Pope. It wasn't just man, but God separating whom the Roman pontiff judged. Now in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, we read about the man of sin exalting himself supra, or above all that is called God. Here we find the word that the Pope is, according to the fullness of power, we can dispense above, supra, above the law. 2 Thessalonians 2:4 spoke about the man of sin, qui adversator ex extolitor supra, omni quod dicitor Deus. Supra, there it is.
Above.
direct fulfillment of
Yeah.
Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So I went through and looked up multiple fonts, multiple copies, and for all of these statements where the Pope was shown to be God, you can just see Deum just circled all over the place. There's just so many copies of these right here. And the principle was that every cleric must obey the Pope, even if he command what is wrong, for no one can judge him. The only exception was if the command involved heresy or tended to the destruction of the church. Now, this next slide right here was an interesting one. It was an exaltet where you see a song to the Latin Lucifer. And
What?
yeah, Lucifer. Now, Lucifer being light bearer, some people have argued, well, in the Latin Vulgate, Lucifer was referred to Christ in the Latin Vulgate. In the KJV, there's a distinction. In the English, Lucifer is referred to for the devil. So my response to this is, well, what Lucifer are they singing to? Are they singing to Christ, the genuine Christ, or are they singing to the devil?
Mm.
And I believe that the evidence points to the devil. This was an interesting work right here. We see the Catholic canon law on dealing with heretics, the 12th Ecumenical Council. On church use of secular authorities to deal with heretics, we excommunicate and anathematize every heresy that raises against the Holy Orthodox and Catholic faith. As to the property of the condemned, if they are laymen, let it be confiscated. As if clerics, let it be applied to the churches from which they received revenues. But if they are only suspected, due consideration being given to the nature, the suspicion, and the character of the person, unless they prove their innocence by a proper defense, let them be anathematized and avoided by all until they make suitable satisfaction. There was quite a lot of power that was exerted here, seizing territory, suspension of rights for individuals, and we're going to kind of close on some of that here. But the individuals who are making these kinds of pretentious claims, they were defended by Pope Innocent III. Should priests with more than one concubine be considered bigamous, since they do not incur the irregularity of bigamy, as it is noted with them as simple fornication, you may dispense them for the exercise of the priestly office. So here's an interesting pass.
Mm-hmm.
If you were married and you went and slept around, you could not continue to be a priest. But if you did not marry and you slept around, you could continue to be a priest.
But I thought that priests weren't. Was there a time when priests, even in the Catholic Church, were married?
Very early on, we find councils prohibiting marriage. So very early on, we do find councils that prohibited marriage explicitly for priests. But my concern with this kind of passage is, if you were not married and you slept around, you got a pass.
Right.
In other words, there was a reward for, if you will, for not being married and being involved in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were married, the bar was different. It's quite interesting. In the 14th century, we find this kind of Protestant work that survived. Francisco Petrarch, "Vengeance must fall on thee, thou filthy whore of Babylon, thou breaker of Christ's fold." And he goes on, "The cankered malice and mischief, more than pen can write, or may tongue be told." In Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, there are copies of that there as well. "The Church of Rome, mixing two governments that ill assort, hath missed her footing, fallen into the mire, and there herself in burden much defiled. Harlot and beast,
Mm-hmm.
mixing them together, they ill assort."
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to comment here briefly. This was another interesting one. Then came the ensigns. We're jumping back here briefly to kind of early history. We're going to talk a little bit here about the abomination of desolation.
Mm-hmm.
Flavius Josephus recognized when Titus came and surrounded, or Cestius came and surrounded Jerusalem, there came ensigns encompassing the eagle, which was the head of the Roman legion, the king and the strongest of all birds, which seemed to them a signal of dominion and an omen that they should conquer against all whom they marched. A lot of people identify the abomination of desolation as something that was associated with Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yeah.
But in this case...
Didn't he take like a pagan to the temple or something like that?
Yeah, but that wasn't even the highest abomination in Ezekiel 8. And not only that, but it was 150 years plus in the prior.
Mm-hmm.
And here we find Here we find Christ speaking about an abomination yet in the future in Matthew 24. So what we find is Cestius comes and surrounds. Here's the winged bird, which was identified with solar sun worship on the sun, these ensigns that had solar discs on them, representing sun worship. And they were planted on the holy ground that extended outside the walls of Jerusalem. You can read about that in, I believe it's Nehemiah, where he actually extends the holy ground outside the walls of Jerusalem. But Cestius pulls back. All the Christians who saw that would have fled, and then Titus comes and seals off the city. Nobody can escape. And if you didn't leave in that interim period, you would be lost. I find this quote by Flavius Josephus quite interesting and insightful into that whole destruction of Jerusalem interplay there. And specifically, we could say a lot more about the back history of the eagle and its connections to sun worship, but I'm not sure that we have the time here in this case. We're going to take a look here briefly at some Waldenses documents. A companion guide to the Waldenses in the Middle Ages by Benedetti. This has a lot of the links right here, if you haven't read this work, to the Waldensian documents. But let's take a look at this fellow right here and just see if this bears out in what we see on the Vatican Digital Library.
But furthermore, the Waldensians were not Proto-Anabaptists, and this is important as well, meaning they didn't agree with the SDA Church regarding the radical separation of church and state, but that the civil magistrates were bound to uphold and observe the law of God as the objective baseline for morality. It was the Anabaptists who believed in a radical separation of church and state, such that there's literally almost virtually zero crossover at all. Any crossover is a fear of back into Romanism, etc. Yeah, the Waldensians were not aligned with the Anabaptists on that. But the SDA Church is like that with the Anabaptists.
Yeah, we're going to test that right here for just a moment. So first off, Anabaptists, did they accept infant baptism?
No.
No, they were not. They were not. They believed that faith must precede baptism.
Yeah.
So, if you think about like anabolic steroids, it grows bigger or whatever. It's adding on to, if you will. Anabaptist, they baptized again. Why did they baptize again? For many people, because they believed that for baptism, in order to be valid, it needed to follow faith. So they rejected infant baptism. Many of their people who were baptized, maybe without their consent, they believed, wait, in order for it to be actually valid, you need to have faith. You need to come and believe first.
Right.
So we see right here that regarding these people, Rhinarius, the Sacco, the 12th century inquisitor, nevertheless, they assert that there were always some who feared God and were saved. Also, they say that infants are saved without baptism. So you did not need to be baptized as an infant. Okay?
Which that's one of the main tenets of Catholicism.
But let's think back here for just a moment. Where do we find evidence of children being saved by the actions of the salvific faith of their parents? You think back in the Exodus? What happened there?
The blood over the doorposts.
Right. What the parents did with the blood over the doorpost was sufficient.
Yeah.
Okay? Until you have the age of consent, when you can make that decision by faith. Here's actually from the Waldenses' own prose, just backing this idea up that we find in the Vatican Digital Library. The third work of Antichrist consists in this baptizing infants in the faith, but also appealing to the secular power. The Waldenses were very much like Adventists in standing for religious liberty, rejecting infant baptism. The charges of these so-called opponents of Adventism fail utterly when you go and look at the original history and documents.
So it's not just that we're using this digital library to, it's not like we're trying to just disprove Catholicism. It's also, it's actually a really good database.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good history there that backs up Adventism's views from a variety of attackers, not just one.
Now, these Waldensian documents that I'm adding in addition to the Vatican here from Trinity, but the eighth work of Antichrist, that he hates and persecutes and searches after and despoils and destroys the members of Christ, so religious persecution. Now, the Waldensian separation of church and state, The 12th century Reinerius Sacco backed this idea up. They say the same thing about secular power, that is, that it is not lawful to punish evildoers and princes and powers. So yeah, they believed in the separation of church and state. In fact, they confessed religious liberty. Here's a confession of that from Vat.Lat 4030. He said in the inquisitorial confession right here in questions, we see the inquisitor stating of Jacques Fournier. He said that if he had the power to put an obstinate heretic to death, he would in no way do so, nor cause their life to be shortened, because he believes he would be sinning. He would have the same matter of conscience concerning denouncing a heretic or believer. He said that those who persecute them do so because the Waldensian brothers are preserving the truth of the gospel. And we see another testimony here. He said that he and those in his order were an object of scorn before all men for the name of Christ, but that those who would sustain the faith until the end would be saved. So they faced persecution. We find evidence right here in Reinerius Sacco that some of these people, like the Cathars, they believe that to eat meat, cheese, or eggs, even in pressing need, is a mortal sin. They say that we see right here in Reinerius' work that the Waldenses said that the Roman Church is church of the wicked, the beast, and the harlot, which are described in the Apocalypse. We find Pope Eugenius right here denouncing those who observe circumcision and the Sabbath and the rest of the legal observances as alien to the faith of Christ. There's multiple evidences right here of the Passigani who were said to uphold and obey the Sabbath. Here's another document right here, Vat.Lat.1291. The Inquisitor Moneta of Cremona, and we've talked about these before, arguing about how the Waldenses argue against the church's authority to establish Sunday, and how the Passigani, another name for the Waldenses, Preposentinus argued to the above the aforesaid heretics add concerning the observance of the Sabbath to prove which they lean in this way. Now these people faced persecution. These two documents right here, the Directorium Inquisitorum from Nicholas Emmerich, actually establishing, actually talking about the Waldenses right here and arguing whether or not it was the Sabbath right here was a shoe reference or a reference to the Sabbath. I see an S right here, the long stroke S. Some people have talked
where
about
are you seeing
F. Sabbati right here. Sabbati. Sabbati. To me, it looks like a reference to the Sabbath. In some manuscripts, they have argued that it's a reference to sotulari, or the sotulari right there, whether or not which is a sandal. So whether or not it's a sandal or the reference to the Sabbath in Nicholas Emmerich's work, there is some discussion in some of those in that particular manuscript. But in that Directorium Inquisitorum we see torture established. So the 61st question, whether the bishop and the inquisitor can expose someone to questions under torture and the indications and causes derived from it. But they go on to state that prelates and inquisitors may put any persons to question by torture, and that it is laudable to torture those of every class who are guilty of heresy, because Rome's position was that she had two swords, the spiritual and the temporal, and that a whole city must be burned on account of the heretics who live in it. Whoever pleases may capture and kill any heretics. There was a Catholic scholar on the same Vatican Library that testified to the Jesuit crimes, attacking, bringing the Saxons and Swedes into the empire and turning the Saxons against the emperor. They have not spared the throne of Rome, but have made it a laughingstock through public writings and actions. More inquisitorial inquisitions right here. He will be interrogated on telling the truth about the Inquisition informed against him, and then he will either confess or deny. So there was no due process in any of this. If you want to look at all the rest of the interesting statements from the Inquisitor's Manual, the American Textbook of Popery has a lot of content about that. We found Wycliffe's charges as well on the Vatican Digital Library as well. And I've got 4 slides left. This one right here, where we find that there was a prohibition against buying or selling for heretics. They were condemned ultimately to be burned alive in the sight of men. And this particular statement was interesting. At the time of the Crusades, there was a statement where they were called forth, when an armed attack is made upon the enemy, let this one cry be raised by the soldiers of God, it is the will of God, it is the will of God, Deus vult. Hegseth.
Oh,
Department of
Pete
Defense.
Hegseth. Oh, that's his tattoo right there.
There's Volt right there. There's his tattoo. There's the original statement where that comes from, actually, in the Crusades.
It is
Isn't
the
it
will of
interesting?
God. It is the will of God.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's the kind of direction that we're seeing America tend to, where people are going back
Right.
to this religion right here. And this is the religion where we find they literally took people who were guilty of homicide, in other words, murderers, and said the very final delusion Satan wants people to believe is that they can go commit crimes against the law of God in the name of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens here. You know, taking you oppressors of children, plunderers of widows, guilty of homicide, of sacrilege, of robbing another's rights, you who await the pay of thieves for the shedding of Christian blood, states to advance boldly as knights of Christ and rush as quickly as you can to the defense of the Eastern Church. Pope Urban II, November 1095. This is the religion right here of Rome. And when we look at what's going on in the United States today, the return of Roman Catholicism, these lessons contained in history reveal what this power is capable of doing and what it will do at the end of time.
Yep. It's showing us where we're heading when you have so many people in American politics today that are kind of turning back, and you have more Catholicism represented than you've had at any point previously. You know, with our Supreme Court, with all the other people that are now in power, it was not used to be the norm. America was started by Protestants, by and large. And so it's interesting to see where we're headed. And that the past does speak through this library.
Every week, the Vatican Digital Library releases new content, and this is all coming out. So we've got a world to warn about it.
And there'll be more stuff coming out too.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and so you won't miss out on further episodes where we're going to be discussing old works like this and how they relate to current affairs and current politics. So thanks for joining us.